May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning, St. Anne's. It's such a delight to be back with you. I was away last weekend because I was at a stunning spiritual retreat up in the Hudson Valley. This retreat center with 130 acres of woods and streams nestled between the Berkshire and Taconic Mountains. So I'm feeling both very refreshed and very Franciscan in spirit. And I also understand why Sabbath is emphasized so much in our tradition, and especially emphasized for clergy, because you are receiving a better priest on the other end of that retreat. Thank you. It was a silent retreat, too, so there were some designated sessions where we would speak only for the purpose of instruction in the tradition or to understand exactly how we ought to meditate. But over 20 hours a day were passed at least with silence from people's mouths. Of course, there were still birds, there was still the burble of the stream, there were still the little bees and the sound of the wind. And it brought home to me, even before we heard this beautiful reading from Howard Thurman, even before I knew that's what we would be reading today, that there is such beauty in the commonplace, which of course is not so common after all, is it? Howard Thurman says for himself, and of course offers to all of us, to seek new levels of awareness of the meaning of the commonplace. And this, of course, is a perfect union for our celebration of the Feast of St. Francis, who, when I asked Family Church this morning, what do you think of St. Francis? What do you know about him? They said, oh, he's the guy with the prayer and the guy who talks about peace, and he's like really kind to animals. And that's true. All of that is true. We'll be doing a blessing of the animals at 1 p.m. in front of the parish house because Francis is the patron saint of animals and ecology. He's a beautiful example of what we might aspire to be, living into the peace of the prayer attributed to him, which we'll sing together in a beautiful adaptation for the offertory today. But as I shared at Family Church, Francis was not always this person. He was born into a very wealthy family in Italy at the end of the 12th century. And because of his status as a wealthy son of a well-established family in Italy at the end of the 12th century, he also went off to war. And he loved his horse, and he loved being this big, powerful guy on a horse going to fight battles. And he wrote about these visions of military victory, of grandeur, of the sort of awe that people might have for him, were he to live into this very particular role of success, of manhood. And yet that didn't work out for him. He could not be the military hero that he dreamed of, and it was in this lowness, in what we might call a depression, in feeling dissatisfied and trying to figure out his life, that God broke in. God broke in through the cracks and said, Francis, rebuild my church. Now, Francis, as any of us might think, looked at the crumbling church in his village, and this is really how the story goes. This is not some meta-analysis about capital campaigns or anything that may be going on with our church that we were talking about rebuilding. There truly was a crumbling church in his village. And so when he heard God say, Francis, rebuild my church, he looked at all his wealth, just like the man we heard in the gospel, everything that his family had stored up for themselves, and he thought quite reasonably, let me take this wealth to rebuild the church. Why not? How could I be more aligned with this call that I hear from God? And so he was doing that. He got into arguments with his father. He ran away at some point. He was just giving away all this money. It was better than the way he was living before because at least it was turned out towards other people and the needs of the world, but it was still this sort of inner turmoil, still this anger, still this sort of restlessness, this lack of direction. And what we see, of course, now looking back with the benefit of centuries, is that this was only the beginning of Francis's story. that he would indeed, more or less, grow into this peace-loving saint that we celebrate today, the one who preaches to birds, the one who made friends with the wolf, the one who assembled around him a community that would become the Franciscan friars, who welcomed women like Clare of Assisi into spiritual leadership, into community, in a way that hadn't been seen before. And that's a beautiful thing. What strikes me most about his legacy today, especially coming off this retreat, is how he was able to move through his life from a place of such self-centeredness and also world-centeredness. World-centeredness meaning the wealth, the power, the prestige, and how he traces an arc for us to what it means to be truly God-centered. And what we see in Francis's example is that to be God-centered does not mean that suddenly we're not concerned with anything or anyone else, but it's a radical opening to everything and everyone else. We sang an adaptation of Francis's Canticle of the Sun as our processional hymn, and his beautiful language around brother sun, sister water, we even hear sister death in some of the later verses, that he saw through his personal transformation, through his move towards God-centeredness, a connection between all creation, that he was not above and he was not outside of, that he was not called to live as a hermit, he was not called away from creation, he was called into the center of it. And as I said, I am in a sort of Franciscan state of mind after spending so much time communing with nature. And one of the things I've been reflecting on that was convicting to me as I was sitting in all those long hours of silence during the retreat is that I forgot what it meant to be connected with other beings in that way. I spent so much time, I even talked about it in my first sermon for the season of creation, that we are all connected and we're all made in goodness, and love is a geophysical force that unites all of us. And I was saying that and I believed it, but it hadn't actually penetrated. Because what was blocking me from that unity, what was blocking me from that communion, what was blocking me from that kinship with the earth that Francis so beautifully describes, was so much anger at the way the world was. Father Craig talked in his sermon last week about looking at the state of everything and feeling like he wanted to crawl back into bed and just pull the covers over his head. And I totally get that. But I think where Father Craig wants to pull the covers over his head, I want to run outside and burn something down. Be like, what are we? What are we doing here? This is not acceptable. And wherever you find yourself on the continuum of Brendan to Craig, you are valid too. There is space for that expression here. But I was so angry, and the anger would just breed in me that even as I would try to attach to these beautiful things, it would become twisted. So instead of meditating on the beauty of the earth, I would look over and be like, why isn't that person embracing the beauty of the earth? Like, it wasn't enough for me to be in that space, to be in that zone, to be in that spiritual community. It kept getting bent because I had not actually experienced, or it had been a while since I experienced, and it had corroded in me, that true connection with creation, the kinship with our beautiful earth. So I experienced a real renewal on this retreat, and I experienced a release of that anger. I experienced the flooding in of love into my body again, and I really felt it during the prayer, during the meditation, during our communion service. Over the course of Francis's life, what we see is that although he first thought, understandably, that the call to rebuild the church was a physical church in a physical place, what he represents to us is that the call to rebuild God's church is more meaningfully the church inside of us. Do we have a structure open up in our hearts that will invite in the Christ? Are we tending to the parts of ourselves that are welcoming that infinite love, that are welcoming that renewal, that are opening up with arms spread wide to all people, to all beings? Because that is the spiritual life. It is, as Howard Thurman says, to elevate the meaning of the commonplace, to find those sources of wonder, to allow ourselves to look at a child, to look at a stream, to look at a caterpillar, like we heard from Meister Eckhart last week, and feel a flood of emotion, feel an expansiveness, feel a connection. And this is our antidote to the corrosive power of despair and anger. I preached in one of my very first sermons at St. Anne's that anger can be a good thing. Anger can be the Holy Spirit in us telling us that something is wrong. And I stand by that. I think anger can be a very powerful tool for justice and a prophetic cry, but only when it's relational. Only when it is born out of love and born out of God's justice, not our justice, and born out of a desire for connection, for peace. Otherwise, our anger and the anger I experienced is only curdling our hearts. It's only making things worse, more toxic, more unsuited for the life and light of Christ. It's so easy to name what we're fighting against. And it becomes harder, at least for me, to stay focused on what I'm fighting for. I got lunch with my friend, Father Carl Adair, the other day. He's a priest at a new mission in Sunnyside, All Saints Episcopal Mission. And he was telling me about the life cycle of a native plant. And if you are someone who grows native plants, you could probably explain this better than I do, but I'm going to take my best shot. Most of us are used to being able to go to, Mazzoni Hardware, a nursery, and pick up some beautiful, bright annual and stick it in the ground. And it's not really suited for the soil. It's not really supposed to be in this part of the world, but it's really bright and it's really great, and you can water it and it looks beautiful. And it really is so metaphorically suited to this culture of quick fixes and of quick access to dopamine that we have. And many people, when they start to tend native plants, will feel frustrated because the native plant isn't beautiful right away. You may actually not really see it for a long time, for years. And he said what people who are used to this growth process will say is that the first year that you plant a native plant, it will sleep. And the second year, if you're lucky, it will creep. It will start to grow. And the third year is when it will leap. So it sleeps, it creeps, and then it leaps, because it takes time to tend, because it's putting roots deep in the soil, because it's meant to be here. And so it's taking its time, connecting to all the other little plants and creatures in this beautiful ecological network. And it's such an obvious and yet profound metaphor for the spiritual life that we can't just plant a bright flower in our hearts and expect it to take root and expect to be totally different people one day to the next. No. If we want to feel hope, if we want to feel love, if we want to feel connection, if we want to open ourselves to the Spirit of Christ, then we have to tend our hearts like native plants. We have to let our hearts sleep. If you're tired, then be tired. Let yourself rest. We have to allow ourselves to grow slowly in some ways, to creep out once we feel like we have that stability. And then, only then, can we leap forward in the spiritual life, to do something bold, to do something fantastic, to live into that fullness of God's call for us. Now, it may not take 3 years. I don't know. Episcopalians love threes, so I think maybe a 3-year cycle could be good, but may come faster, may come slower. But this idea that just as Francis, we are tending to our internal lives so that we can make an impact in the external world. We're first fixing our relationship to God so that we can be open to what we're receiving from each other, from the earth, from this beautiful creation that God made. And in doing this, we move from a place of fighting, of anger, of despair, of being opposed to or against, to a place where we are acting, even if we are acting in anger, even if we're acting with urgency, it is coming from a place of love, because our internal life has been transformed. We have rebuilt God's church within ourselves so that Christ can dwell there, and Christ becomes the animating force for our lives. I kept thinking, as I was meditating on the life of Francis this week and everything I had learned about, or from the retreat, about that quote in Lord of the Rings when Frodo and Sam are on Mount Mordor and Mount of Doom. I'm sorry, I only watched the movies. I never read the books. So I don't know if this is in the books as well. But there's that poignant moment where the ring is so close to being destroyed, and they've gone so far, and they're so tired. And Frodo is ready to give up. He doesn't remember why they were doing this anymore. He doesn't remember strawberries and cream in the Shire. He doesn't remember dancing. He doesn't remember this circle of friends. He doesn't remember the green grass. And Sam is there. And Sam is the one who starts recounting to him, remember, Mr. Frodo, remember all this beauty, remember all that we're living for, remember all that we're fighting for. And he said, there's some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. And I wonder if the message is as simple as this, that in following the simplicity of Francis, perhaps the first and most potent step we can take is reorienting ourselves to what we consider commonplace, is opening ourselves to the wonder of what we call common, to allow ourselves to reconnect to what is good, to not get hung up in the ways that I know I certainly do on every single piece of news, to use that as a bludgeon against someone who practices differently than I do, or who thinks differently than I do, or who maybe doesn't have the information that I have. To move beyond what we think the shoulds of our lives are, especially when those are imposed externally, and move again to building in ourselves a dwelling place for Christ. You know, your body is a temple. That's what we've heard for years and years, right? Your body is also the church of God. Your heart is the seat of Christ. And if we do anything as a community, following in the example of Francis, taking seriously those beautiful words of Howard Thurman, then I would want us to shift from what we think needs to be fixed towards what ought to be treasured. To shift from what we think we need to do to what God is calling us to. To move away from what we're against and embrace fully what we're for. To believe deeply that there is good in this world and it is worth fighting for. Not to let the despair, the anger, the helplessness be in the seat of our hearts, but to let Christ drive that. This is what I'm trying to do, is find that place between the tenderness and between the heartbreak and stay there. Because I think that's where love grows the most. I think that's where those native plants put those roots deep, deep into the soil of our being. I think that is where we will find the most fertile soil for our spiritual lives, for connection to each other, for connection to this beautiful world, because it's the truest place to be, because it recognizes the love and it recognizes the grief, because it holds all with gentle, open hands. And it is from that place that we, as Francis did, can be instruments of peace, can be conduits of Christ in this world.